Have you ever felt a fear so deep, so primal, that it seemed to come from nowhere, like an unseen storm cloud hanging over your soul? Maybe it wakes you at night. Maybe it disables you in rooms filled with people. And yet, you can't trace it to any trauma of your own. What if I told you that this fear isn't yours? It's inherited, passed down through generations, encoded in emotional DNA, carried like invisible baggage from those who came before you. What if your attempts to outrun it, to reason it away, only strengthen its grip, because it's not located in your present, but in the hidden past? Tonight, we begin a journey into the deepest layers of the human psyche, guided by Carl Jung's groundbreaking ideas. We'll explore how fear, especially the unexplainable kind, can be inherited via the collective unconscious through generational trauma, mother wounds, somatic echoes, and emotional transference. Together, we'll uncover how this fear masquerades as part of your identity, shapes your relationships, and influences your body in subtle yet profound ways. This is not just theoretical, it's deeply personal. It's about you reclaiming agency over the parts of yourself that aren't truly yours, and finding liberation in awareness. 10 chapters. Each woven narrative invites you deeper into emotional truth, ancestral healing, and psychological freedom. This is not a video. It is an invitation to remember, to feel, to heal. Have you ever walked into a room and felt a sense of dread for no reason at all? Or had an anxiety that seemed completely disconnected from your life experiences? It's a terrifying realization, to feel unsafe in a world that hasn't shown you any clear threat. These are not just random sensations, they are echoes of something deeper, older, and often unspoken. When fear doesn't have a logical source, our minds try to make one up. Maybe I'm just broken, or maybe something is wrong with me. But what if you are carrying someone else's fear in your body, an emotional inheritance silently passed down through bloodlines in silence? Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." But it's not just unlived dreams we inherit. It's unresolved emotions, especially fear. You may feel like you're the first to struggle with this shadow, but in truth, it's likely been following your lineage for generations. Fear that was never spoken, never processed, becomes encoded not just in family stories but in nervous systems, behaviors, and identities. You were born into a psychological atmosphere, and if no one ever cleared the emotional air, you've been breathing it in your entire life without even knowing it. This kind of fear doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up with a name or a history. It hides in patterns: the need to be hyper-vigilant, the tendency to distrust joy, the impulse to shrink when you're seen. These are the unconscious rituals of inherited fear. They shape how we live, how we love, how we view ourselves, and often we never question them. That's what makes inherited fear so dangerous. Because it doesn't feel borrowed. It feels like home, like personality, like fate. But this is the first step of awakening. Realizing that not everything you carry originated with you. Some of your pain might be ancient, and therefore not your fault. Yet if the fear didn't begin with you, then neither must it end with you. This is the power and the responsibility we face when exploring inherited fear. You become the one who sees what was hidden, who feels what was avoided, who transforms what was transmitted unconsciously. It's a sacred act to look at a fear that has haunted your family line and whisper, "I see you." In doing so, you open the door to healing, not just for yourself, but for those who came before and those who will come after. The fear you can't explain may not be yours, but the healing of it might be your legacy. Imagine this. A child is born into a home where war, poverty, or abandonment once left deep psychological scars. But no one talks about it. The trauma is buried, the pain unspoken, yet its energy lingers. That child grows up in an atmosphere charged with invisible tension. There's no overt violence, no direct threat, and yet the child feels a sense of dread, of tightness in the chest, of walking on emotional eggshells. This is emotional DNA. Just as we inherit the color of our eyes or the structure of our bones, we also inherit the imprints of emotional responses, not through genes alone, but through nervous system imprinting, early childhood dynamics, and unconscious behavioral modeling. Your fear might not be logical because it wasn't born in logic. It was inherited in silence, tension, avoidance, and stored not in your thoughts but in your body. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious in one generation will be lived out in the next as fate. When trauma is too overwhelming for a person to integrate, it doesn't just vanish, it becomes a psychic residue. A residue that can be passed down through stories never told, emotions never expressed, and patterns never broken. A parent who never learned to self-regulate might respond to stress with anger or withdrawal, unknowingly teaching the child to anticipate threat or to associate love with instability. A grandparent who lived through terror may pass on a hyper-alert nervous system to a grandchild who has never faced danger but lives in a state of persistent anxiety. We call this intergenerational trauma. It is not metaphor, it is reality. Trauma creates a blueprint, and unless that blueprint is examined, questioned, and rewritten, it becomes a quiet inheritance. Science is finally catching up to what intuition and depth psychology have whispered for decades. Studies in epigenetics now show that severe emotional stress can actually alter the expression of certain genes, and these changes can be transmitted to future generations. A Holocaust survivor's grandchild may experience cortisol dysregulation, even if they grew up in safety. Children of war refugees may exhibit increased fear responses despite living far from violence. This doesn't mean your destiny is sealed. It means your story didn't start with you. And the emotional puzzles you struggle with today might have pieces scattered across the decades. This awareness can be both destabilizing and liberating. Because once you realize the fear in your system might not originate from your own life, a question is born: what if I can stop carrying what was never mine to hold? To break the cycle of inherited fear, you must become what Jung called the wounded healer, the one who brings consciousness into the dark places of the psyche. This work is not easy. It requires feeling emotions that were never yours, grieving losses you didn't personally experience, and developing compassion for those who hurt you, not because they were right, but because they were also hurt. Emotional DNA doesn't change through willpower alone. It changes through awareness, integration, and conscious interruption of patterns. You are not doomed to repeat what was passed down, but to change the story, you must read it first. You must be willing to feel what others avoided, to question what was taught in silence, and to honor the fact that healing yourself may very well be healing your entire bloodline. That's not just self-work, it's ancestral work. And it begins with the courage to ask, whose fear am I living? Before we learn to speak, before we have words or even thoughts, we absorb. The first environment we ever know is not the outside world, it's our mother's body. Her heartbeat becomes our rhythm. Her breath teaches us pacing. Her nervous system calibrates our own. If she was anxious, overwhelmed, or emotionally unavailable, we feel it not as observation but as sensation. A mother's unspoken fears become an atmosphere, a silent language that teaches the child how safe or unsafe the world is. This is not about blaming mothers. It is about understanding the transference of energy that occurs long before we develop. Logic. A child doesn't interpret the anxiety of their caregiver as the caregiver's problem. They internalize it as evidence that the world is dangerous, or worse, that they are the problem. Thus begins the deep, often invisible wound of inherited anxiety, not as an external message but as an internal identity. Carl Jung emphasized the influence of the mother archetype, not only as a personal figure but as a psychic foundation for the soul. When the mother is fearful, emotionally inconsistent, or overly enmeshed, the child's early psychological structure begins to form around a distorted mirror. The child learns to scan for emotional cues, constantly adjusting to stay good, to avoid upsetting the fragile balance. This emotional hypervigilance, rooted in survival, becomes a personality trait. The sensitive, overly responsible, anxious adult was once a child trying to manage a world that felt emotionally unsafe. The mother wound is not always visible. It doesn't always come from abuse or neglect. Sometimes it comes from love that is anxious, overprotective, or deeply wounded. And when that energy is passed down, it teaches a child not how to thrive, but how to survive, how to manage others' emotions before even learning to regulate their own. In utero, a fetus experiences the world chemically. If the mother is chronically stressed, her body floods with cortisol, which crosses the placenta and influences fetal development. Studies have shown that children born to anxious mothers are more likely to develop heightened stress responses, even without environmental threats. After birth, this continues in more subtle but equally powerful ways. A mother's gaze, her tone, her way of soothing, or not soothing, becomes the template for how a child relates to emotion. If she withdraws when overwhelmed, the child may learn that emotions are dangerous. If she becomes anxious at the child's distress, the child learns that their feelings are too much. Over time, these patterns become internalized as self-concepts. I must not cry. I need to be easy. My emotions are a burden. Thus, the mother's unprocessed anxiety becomes the child's silent inheritance, shaping their emotional vocabulary before they even learn to speak. Healing the mother wound is not about casting blame. It is about retrieving the parts of ourselves that we abandoned to maintain connection. The child may have felt they needed to be small to be loved, quiet to be safe, or perfect to avoid rejection. As adults, these survival adaptations become emotional prisons. We people please, overthink, or shrink ourselves without knowing why. To heal, we must bring awareness to what was absorbed unconsciously. We must begin to differentiate between what we felt and what was transferred to us. Through inner child work, shadow integration, and nervous system healing, we can learn to reparent ourselves, to become the secure base we never had. And perhaps most importantly, we can develop compassion for our mothers, not as perfect beings, but as women with their own unhealed stories. In doing so, we don't just free ourselves, we break the energetic contract of inherited anxiety, making space for a new legacy to begin. Carl Jung believed that beneath the personal unconscious lies something deeper, something older, more universal. He called it the collective unconscious, a reservoir of inherited psychic material shared by all humans. It contains what Jung referred to as archetypes, primal, symbolic images and patterns of behavior that influence how we perceive and respond to the world. Among these archetypes, fear is a constant companion, not just individual fear, but ancestral fear, instinctual, pre-verbal, deeply encoded. We inherit it not as memory, but as tendency. The fear of abandonment, of the unknown, of death, of powerlessness. These are not just personal issues. They are part of the emotional blueprint of our species. Jung suggested that we don't only carry our own traumas, but also the echoes of a collective emotional history. In this sense, the fear you feel in your chest may not be yours alone. It may be an echo from generations past reverberating through time. Consider the archetype of the wounded child or the orphan. These are not just storybook tropes. They are psychological blueprints buried deep within the psyche. You might find yourself reacting with panic when you feel left out, even if your adult mind knows it's irrational. That fear may be tapping into the archetypal fear of abandonment that stretches back through centuries of human experience, where being left alone once meant death. Or the fear of speaking up in a group might not come from a single traumatic event, but from the deeper archetype of the witch or the heretic, symbols of those persecuted for standing apart from the group. Jung taught us that these archetypes are not conscious. They live in the shadows of our awareness, animating us from within. That's why certain fears feel larger than life, or unexplainable, because they don't originate solely from your life. They come from the life of the human collective. Fear in the collective unconscious often operates like a myth repeating itself. You might not consciously believe the world is dangerous, but your body tightens as if it were. You might not remember being punished for your truth, but your throat closes every time you try to speak up. The archetypes aren't logical. They are emotional, energetic, and symbolic. When Jung explored dreams, myths, and fairy tales across cultures, he found the same patterns of fear, danger, and survival repeating themselves. These symbols, snakes, shadows, storms, monsters, speak the language of the unconscious. So when you experience a fear that doesn't seem to make sense, it may be rooted in one of these deep symbolic patterns. You're not broken. You're human. You're carrying the fears encoded in the collective psyche, fears that were once necessary for survival, but which now unconsciously limit your freedom, creativity, and authenticity. The path to healing this inherited fear is not to suppress it or shame it, but to recognize it. Jungian therapy doesn't aim to eliminate fear. It aims to bring it into consciousness, to give form to the formless. When we acknowledge that some of our deepest fears are archetypal, we stop personalizing them as flaws. Instead, we begin a dialogue with the unconscious. We ask, what story is this fear telling? What myth is it reactivating? The moment we see fear not as an enemy, but as a messenger from the collective depths of the psyche, we shift into a place of empowered awareness. We move from being haunted to being curious, and in doing so, we break the trance. The fear may not vanish, but it will no longer dominate us. For what lives in shadow loses its grip when brought into the light of consciousness. That is the beginning of liberation, not just from our own wounds, but from the ancient fears we've unknowingly carried. Imagine a child barely able to speak, already learning how to modulate their voice, suppress their emotions, or avoid certain expressions, not because they are taught directly, but because the emotional atmosphere demands it. This is not discipline, it's survival. Children are extraordinarily perceptive, not intellectually, but emotionally and energetically. Before we have language, we have sensation. We read the temperature of a room not through words but through tension in the air, tone of voice, facial expressions, and most of all, the unpredictability of the adults we depend on. If a parent is anxious, volatile, dismissive, or emotionally absent, the child internalizes the message. The world is not safe unless I adapt. This is where fear first embeds itself, not as a choice, but as a strategy. The nervous system adjusts. The smile becomes a mask. And fear, instead of being a temporary response, becomes a permanent operating system. One of the most misunderstood realities of childhood fear is that it doesn't need overt abuse to take root. Emotional neglect, inconsistent attunement, or simply living with a caregiver overwhelmed by their own pain can be enough to create a nervous system wired for hypervigilance. A child doesn't yet have the capacity to say, "My parent is emotionally unavailable." Instead, the child says, "Something must be wrong with me." In order to avoid the pain of rejection or abandonment, the child subconsciously molds themselves into whatever version feels safest: quiet, agreeable, invisible, funny, obedient. This adaptation may look like a personality trait later in life, but it's not. It's a scar. It's fear frozen into form. And what makes this so insidious is that these fear-based adaptations are often praised. She's so easygoing. He never complains. They're such a good listener. But beneath that social polish is a child still scanning for danger. This fear becomes encoded into the identity. By the time the child becomes an adult, they may no longer recognize their own fear as unnatural. It has become just who I am. They might say, "I'm a perfectionist and I hate conflict," or "I just don't like attention," without realizing these traits are not preferences but protections. The original fear that created the need to please, avoid, or perform is buried beneath layers of normalized behavior. They might avoid intimacy because it feels too overwhelming or suffocating. They may freeze when needing to set a boundary or speak a truth because deep down, their nervous system still remembers, "When I assert myself, I lose love." Fear doesn't announce itself with flashing lights. It hides in habits, preferences, and social personas. And unless it is brought into the light, it becomes the invisible architect of a life that looks calm on the surface but feels like quiet panic underneath. Healing this kind of childhood fear is not about blaming parents or revisiting trauma for its own sake. It's about understanding the precise emotional ecosystem that taught you who it was safe to be. Carl Jung wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." What many of us call personality is actually a trauma response dressed in the clothes of identity. The work, then, is to return to the emotional blueprint and ask, who did I become to survive? And who am I beneath that survival strategy? This is not regression, it's reclamation. It's about gently reparenting yourself, creating the inner conditions of safety that allow fear to loosen its grip. Slowly, through awareness and somatic healing, the child inside begins to understand, I am no longer in danger. I can stop performing. I can exist without fear. And that realization doesn't just heal the present, it redefines the past and reshapes the future. At some point, what begins as a defense mechanism becomes a mirror. We no longer see the difference between who we are and what we learned to be. This is the tragic triumph of fear. When the original wound is so old and so buried, we confuse the scar for skin. Many people walk through life with personalities built entirely on adaptation. They don't realize they've mistaken fear for identity. The hyper-independent woman who never asks for help may say, I've always been strong, when in fact she learned early on that vulnerability invited disappointment or danger. The man who prides himself on being emotionally detached may believe he's just logical, but underneath that stoicism lies a terrified child who never had the space to feel without shame. This is not authenticity. This is armor that hardened over time, so thoroughly fused with the self that removing it feels like disintegration. But what is falling apart is not your truth. It's the false self that fear built. Carl Jung's notion of the persona is crucial here. The persona is the mask we wear to fit into society, to gain approval, to avoid rejection. It is useful, but when mistaken for the self, it becomes a prison. Fear reinforces the persona by telling us it's dangerous to be seen as we truly are. Over time, the authentic self retreats into the unconscious, leaving the fear-adapted version of us in charge. And that version is often well received. People love the agreeable coworker, the self-sacrificing friend, the dependable partner. But the person behind the mask is exhausted. They smile while slowly vanishing. Their life might look peaceful, but inside, there is a silent war between authenticity and approval. When fear becomes identity, even moments of truth feel unsafe. You second-guess your desires. You invalidate your needs. You become emotionally homesick for a self you barely remember, but still feel, deep down, is trying to return. This false identity is often supported by the world around us. Society rewards the persona. The more you suppress, the more you're praised. You're so easy to be around. You never cause problems. You're always in control. These compliments reinforce the illusion that your survival strategy is actually your nature. But what looks like stability may be self-abandonment. What appears to be confidence may be dissociation. And this is the heartbreaking part. The longer you live in a false identity, the more alien your true self begins to feel. When you try to break out, when you dare to say no, express anger, feel joy without guilt, the people around you may resist. They've grown comfortable with your mask. They've formed relationships not with your soul, but with your adaptation. So when you start reclaiming your truth, you may feel not only afraid, but also deeply alone. This is why the journey back to the self often begins with grief. But grief is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're finally telling the truth. The false identity doesn't dissolve all at once. It unravels, layer by painful layer, through moments of courage and rupture. You begin to notice the small betrayals, the way you laugh at things that hurt, the way you shrink when you want to speak up, the way you apologize just for existing. These micro-compromises become intolerable when your soul is waking up, and slowly, the body responds. Your voice shakes less when you say what you feel. Your back straightens when you set a boundary. Your breath deepens when you're not performing. This is the return to self. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong unfolding of the real you, freed from the demands of fear, expectation, and inherited pain. The false self begins to fade, not in anger, but in compassion. You realize, I wore this mask to survive, but I don't need it anymore. Long after the conscious mind forgets, or never even understands, the body still remembers. Muscles tense before the threat arrives. The stomach knots when silence falls in a room. The chest tightens around intimacy. These aren't overreactions. They're echoes of emotional experiences that may not even be your own. Somatic psychology teaches us that trauma isn't just stored in the mind. It's held in the nervous system, in fascia, in posture, in chronic symptoms we've learned to normalize. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't just live in thought, but in form, in pattern, in energy. And nowhere does this become more evident than in the body. You may have inherited your grandmother's anxious vigilance without ever hearing her story. You may carry your father's suppressed rage in the tension of your jaw. The body doesn't need language to remember pain. It just needs repetition. And unresolved fear repeats across generations like a ghost that's never been named. Many people live with chronic physical discomforts that medicine can't explain. Migraines, back pain, digestive issues, insomnia. What if these are not merely physical ailments but somatic expressions of emotional inheritance? Studies in epigenetics show us that trauma alters gene expression, meaning your ancestors' fear can literally shape your physiology. It's not metaphorical, it's biological. This is why certain environments feel unsafe even when no threat is visible. Your body learned to anticipate danger long before your mind could understand it. And because much of this fear is implicit, it bypasses logic. You can't talk your body out of fear. It has to be unlearned through presence, safety, and embodiment. You have to listen to what your body has been trying to tell you, that you've been carrying more than your share, that your freeze response isn't weakness, it's history, that your fatigue isn't laziness, it's inherited hypervigilance. This is not your flaw, it is your inheritance. Somatic healing begins not with force, but with permission. The permission to slow down, to breathe into the tension instead of running from it, to feel the tremor without judging it. This is foreign to many of us who were raised to push through, to numb out, to perform wellness instead of embodying it. But the truth is, your body is wise. It doesn't lie, it doesn't exaggerate. It stores what your mind couldn't handle at the time. And when you're ready, it will offer it back to you, not to punish you, but to free you. That chronic tightness in your shoulders? It might be the burden of unshed grief, that clenching in your gut, a scream your inner child never got to release. Healing requires becoming fluent in the language of the body, one that speaks in breath, sensation, and stillness. As Jung wrote, the shoe that fits one person pinches another. The same is true of healing. Your body's story is unique and only you can walk it back to truth. To heal generational fear somatically is to interrupt a lineage of silence. It is to say, the pain stops here, not because I reject my ancestors, but because I honor them enough to stop repeating what hurt them. This isn't about blaming those who came before. It's about giving your nervous system the safety they never had. It's about allowing joy where there was only survival, calm where there was only chaos. When you begin to regulate your body, you begin to rewrite the story written into your cells. You become the first in your line to rest without guilt, to speak without shaking, to feel without shutting down. This is legacy work, not in the sense of inheritance, but in transformation. Jung's process of individuation is not just about discovering who you are, but releasing who you were told to be. And much of that story is written in flesh, not thought. The body is the threshold between what was and what can be, and it remembers everything until you choose to remember it differently. Relationships are often the mirror through which the unconscious reveals itself. As Carl Jung observed, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Nowhere is this more evident than in the realm of emotional inheritance. When we enter into relationships, romantic, familial, or platonic, we don't just bring our preferences and personalities, We bring our unhealed wounds, our unconscious fears, and the unresolved stories of those who came before us. We project what we've never made conscious. The partner who feels emotionally distant may unconsciously evoke the father who was never present. The friend who sets strong boundaries may trigger old shame taught by a controlling caregiver. And yet, we rarely see this as projection. We simply say, they make me feel this way. But the truth is more complex. They activate a pain that was already there, long before they arrived. In inherited trauma, the psyche clings to the familiar, even when it hurts. You may find yourself attracted to emotionally unavailable partners, not because you're broken, but because your nervous system was wired in an environment where love and abandonment coexisted. You learn to survive that paradox, and now, subconsciously, you seek it out again, because it feels like home. This is not your fault. It's the consequence of living out patterns that were passed down, often without language or awareness. Jung described these repetitions as complexes, emotional clusters formed in childhood that distort perception and drive behavior. And relationships become the stage where these complexes play out again and again. Until we become conscious of them, we are not in relationship with the person in front of us, we're in relationship with our past, projected onto their face. Healing begins with asking, what am I really reacting to, and who am I really seeing? The most painful realization in shadow work is this. Much of the conflict we experience in relationships isn't about the other person. It's about what they reflect in us. That's the power of projection. The overbearing partner may expose our fear of being controlled, mirroring a childhood where autonomy wasn't safe. The friend who pulls away may trigger our abandonment wound, echoing the emotional neglect we never processed. And yet, instead of turning inward, we often blame outward. But projection is not an accusation, it's an invitation. An invitation to meet the parts of ourselves that never felt seen, protected, or allowed to feel. Jung believed that through conscious relationship, we are given the chance to individuate, to reclaim what is ours, and return what is not. When you begin to observe your projections without judgment, you take the first step out of emotional reactivity and into self-awareness. This is where true intimacy begins, not just with others but with yourself. Breaking the cycle of emotional inheritance in relationships requires radical honesty. It means asking yourself, am I loving this person, or am I trying to resolve something through them? Am I reacting to their behavior or to my own unhealed memory? It also requires compassion for yourself and for the generations that lived in survival, not self-awareness. They didn't pass down these patterns because they were malicious. They passed them down because it was all they knew. But you know more now. You see the pattern. And in that seeing, you have the power to interrupt it. This doesn't mean relationships become easy. It means they become conscious. It means choosing connection over reenactment, boundaries over chaos, truth over the comfort of familiarity. And when you do this, you don't just change your life. You change the relational blueprint of your lineage. You stop projecting the past into the present and instead start creating a future that's truly your own. One of the most liberating and challenging steps in healing inherited fear and trauma is learning to reclaim what was never truly yours. Generations before us passed down fears, anxieties, and emotional burdens, often silently and unconsciously. These inherited weights shape how we perceive ourselves in the world, yet they are not intrinsic to our authentic identity. The process of reclamation begins with awareness, noticing which fears, behaviors, and emotional patterns belong to your personal experience, and which are echoes from ancestors, caregivers, or cultural wounds. This distinction is crucial because much of what we carry as ours is actually borrowed, fear that was never ours to hold, pain that belongs to others, yet deeply embedded in our nervous system. Recognizing this allows us to begin disentangling our true self from the inherited narrative. Energetic boundaries become vital in this journey. Just as physical boundaries protect our bodies, energetic boundaries protect our emotional and psychological space. These boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but rather clear lines that distinguish your experience from that of others. When we lack these boundaries, we unconsciously absorb emotional toxins and fears from those around us, further confusing our identity with generational wounds. Through practices such as inner child healing, meditation, or therapeutic shadow work, we start building these boundaries, learning to say, "This is not mine." This reclamation is a form of individuation, as Jung described it, becoming who you are by shedding what is not you. It is a radical reclaiming of autonomy over your emotional landscape, a courageous step toward freedom. Part of reclaiming what was never yours is also understanding that healing is not a solitary process. You don't simply unburden yourself, you carry the potential to heal the lineage. This ancestral healing transcends time. As you release the inherited fears and patterns, you create a ripple effect that impacts not only your life but those who came before and those yet to come. It's a profound act of love and responsibility. However, this process requires patience and compassion because the inherited wounds are deeply rooted in family dynamics and cultural narratives. Often, reclaiming means forgiving what cannot be changed and honoring the survival strategies that once kept your lineage alive. It means choosing to transform these legacies into conscious strength, breaking cycles of trauma through awareness and intention. Finally, reclaiming what was never yours invites you to reconnect with your authentic self beneath layers of fear and inherited stories. It means discovering the parts of you that have been buried or silenced by trauma, shame, or obligation. This is the journey into the true self, the self that Jung described as whole, creative, and inherently worthy. By reclaiming your energy and identity, you step out of the shadow cast by generational fear and into the light of conscious living. This process doesn't erase pain overnight, but it offers the profound gift of choice. The choice to define who you are, not by your inherited fears but by your own authentic essence. This is the path of healing, individuation, and ultimately, freedom. Healing generational fear begins with the simple yet profound act of conscious awareness. When you shine a light on the invisible patterns and traumas passed down through your lineage, you break the spell of unconscious repetition. This awareness is not just intellectual understanding, it is an embodied, felt knowing that awakens your capacity to transform inherited wounds. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires bringing the unconscious into consciousness. By doing so, you interrupt cycles that have perpetuated fear and anxiety for generations. This awakening is the first step towards healing not only your own soul, but the collective soul of your family and culture. Healing generational trauma also demands deep compassion, especially for those who came before you. It requires understanding that their fears and behaviors were survival strategies in their own times, often the only options available in their contexts. This compassionate perspective softens the blame and resentment that can keep wounds alive. It transforms judgment into empathy and opens the door for forgiveness, not as a denial of harm, but as a release of its hold on you. When you forgive, you dissolve emotional chains and create space for healing energy to flow. This healing is cyclical. As you heal, you empower your ancestors and descendants, bridging time through love and conscious choice. Practical tools to foster this healing include shadow work, somatic therapy, journaling, and meditation, all designed to deepen your relationship with your unconscious mind and body. Shadow work, in particular, invites you to face the hidden fears and patterns you've inherited with honesty and courage. As you integrate these shadow aspects, you reclaim your energy and transform fear into wisdom. Somatic practices remind you that healing is not just a mental exercise, it is a full-body experience that dissolves tension and trauma held in muscle and nerve. Journaling can reveal recurring themes and help you articulate and process inherited fears. Meditation cultivates the spaciousness needed to observe and transcend old patterns. Ultimately, healing generational fear through consciousness is a revolutionary act of freedom and love. It means choosing to no longer be defined or controlled by invisible chains. It means embodying the power to rewrite your family story from fear to courage, from silence to voice, from unconscious reaction to intentional creation. This path honors Carl Jung's vision of psychological wholeness and spiritual liberation. By healing your inherited fears, you contribute to a collective awakening that transcends personal history. Your conscious presence becomes a beacon for others still trapped in the shadows of their past, illuminating the way toward a future where fear no longer dictates the rhythms of our lives. As we journey through the tangled web of inherited fear, one truth becomes clear. Much of what frightens us is not truly ours. It is the echo of past generations' unresolved pain, etched deep into our emotional DNA and carried silently in our bodies. Carl Jung's insights guide us to recognize these ancestral shadows not as chains, but as keys that unlock deeper self-awareness and liberation. Healing begins the moment we choose to confront these inherited fears with courage, compassion, and conscious presence. It's a profound act of reclaiming our identity and rewriting the stories passed down to us, no longer as victims but as empowered creators of our own lives. This transformation transcends the personal, rippling through our families and collective history, breaking cycles of trauma and planting seeds of freedom. Remember, fear loses its power when met with understanding and light. By embracing this journey of individuation, bringing unconscious patterns into the clear light of consciousness, we step into wholeness and authenticity. The fears that once controlled us become teachers, guiding us toward a life defined not by inherited shadows but by conscious choice, healing, and growth. In this, we find not just freedom from fear, but a profound connection to ourselves and the generations both before and after us, a testament to the enduring human spirit's capacity to heal and transcend.